psychedelics, and he's going to give us an update on a new course that he has created. Thank you, Ron.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everybody. Some of you perhaps were able to participate in last May's course. For many years, we've been doing one on meditation and psychotherapy, as Anne just mentioned, and this last year's theme was on learning from non-ordinary states, in particular psychedelics. And there was enough enthusiasm around it and enough interest now growing in the Harvard Medical School system that we're actually going to break out a separate psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy Harvard Medical School conference. And the first version of it is actually going to be a series of webinars. There'll be 5 or 6 of them next February and May. And as details become available, I'll share them with the group, but it's basically going to be 90-minute sessions from noon to 1:30 on Tuesdays next year. And our own Jim Hopper, I don't know if Jim is here today, but he's been quite active in BPRG. He's one of our confirmed speakers. We'll probably have a couple of other people from the BPRG community as well as from the wider world. We're just very excited that the medical school, which has had its hesitancies around these issues, not the least of which started from Tim Leary and Dick Alpert's ventures early on, is open to this focus.
Great. Thank you so much, Ron. That's exciting news. Next, I'd like to call on Elizabeth Ames and Oleg Orlov. They both are BPRG members. Elizabeth helped to get the Peace Corps going in the Ukraine, and Oleg is a psychologist in the Ukraine, and together they are getting a map site set up in the Ukraine. So Elizabeth and Oleg, please, we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you. Oleg just texted me. He's having trouble connecting, so welcome to working in Ukraine. I can cover for him. He's a fantastic partner. So with Oleg in absentia, I'd like to welcome you to the Ukrainian Psychedelic Research Association, otherwise known as UPRA, which is Ukraine's first above ground organization working to introduce and legalize the potential of psychedelic assisted therapy for trauma mitigation in Ukraine. A huge thank you to all of you. We are inspired by you and leveraged off your learning. What we're trying to do are fourfold. First of all, leverage on the work and the learning that this movement is building here and translating it in a way that's appropriate to on the ground in Ukraine. The second is to mitigate historic trauma. Armies have been marching back and forth across Ukraine since the Mongols invaded in the 13th century, and no family has gone untouched for it. And we also feel this is an opportunity to introduce therapeutic psychedelics to the wider former Soviet Union, because things bleed across borders. And finally, we're very specifically focused on trying to make government-approved therapeutic clinical trials in Ukraine for MDMA and psilocybin in 2 to 3 years. So I don't want to go to take up too much time, but to give you a sense of what we've achieved so far, we're starting from nothing. So what we're doing is leveraging human resources. We've built a chat group, and we're connecting with and building a mainstream psychedelic network of interested people similar to BPRG. We've actually initiated a registration process for an NGO, a nonprofit, to house our work. We've built a harm reduction team in current deployment that's inspired by the MAP Zendo project. And part of the reason Oleg's having trouble connecting is he's leading one of these at a festival right now. And again, our primary goal is focusing on clinical trials, because this is an environment that has no history at all and very little knowledge of Western therapeutic approaches to psychological problems. As an addendum, I'm actually moving to Kiev in the fall to work with Oleg on this. I have deep belief in the possibility of therapeutic psychedelics to be a major turning point for Central Europe. So I will post our contacts. Thank you for all the time listening, and come visit us in Kiev. It's an awesome place.
Oh, that's great, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. It's amazing what you're doing. Really wonderful to
Thank you.
be able to nurture you in any way we possibly can and give Oleg our best.
Okay, thanks.
Sure, thank you. So next, I'd like to invite Leah Mix to come on and give us an update. Leah and I were together in the first CPTR cohort in 2016 and became good friends there. She's a real thought leader in this field, and she's joining us, I think, from the West Coast. So Leah, if you could please give us an update on what you're up to.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne. So good to see you, and just always wonderful to be here with the BPRG community. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about Enthea, which is a nonprofit third-party administrator for psychedelic healthcare. So essentially an insurance company light that we have launched. And our vision is safe, affordable access to psychedelic therapies for all who can benefit, regardless of ability to pay. And the way that we are working to accomplish this is by expediting health insurance coverage for psychedelic therapies by simply creating it. So we are so blessed that many of our team members actually come from the BPRG. So this includes our Chief Medical Officer, Dan Rome, our Chief of Staff, Sherry Rays, our Chief Business Officer, Keith Leetsky, our Manager of Strategic Initiatives, Andrew Ninneman, and our attorney, Jim Roosevelt, who is a participant in the BPRG as well. And we have been so grateful for the support of Anne and Shippen and Ron Miss as well in order to launch this project. So here's the update. Last week, the state of Massachusetts issued Enthea a license to operate as a third-party administrator in the state. This makes us the first health plan administrator in the country who will be creating health plan coverage for psychedelic therapies. Huh. So it is happening. And over the next 4 months, we are going to be launching pilots in 3 areas: in Boston, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and Austin, Texas. If these pilots are successful, it will allow us to scale. And I should mention, we're starting with ketamine-assisted therapy, right? So we're creating a runway leading towards psychedelic-assisted therapies. So if we're successful with our pilots, we will scale to 25 cities this coming year, and then 50 cities in preparation to launch MDMA-assisted therapy at national scale. So that's really our laser focus right now, and benefit coverage for psilocybin-assisted therapy will follow thereafter. So in order to achieve this goal, there are 4 kind of mission critical tasks that we have underway. So 4 component parts. The first is to build our network. So we are seeking to partner with ketamine-assisted therapy providers who intend on adding psychedelic assisted therapy to their service offerings as soon as those become legal. We're so grateful that we have 4 providers in the Bay Area as our flagship providers for our pilot there, 2 providers in the Austin area, and we have interest from providers in the Boston as well, and looking to expand our network in the Boston area and nationally. So if you are a provider who may be interested in participating in the Anthea network in the near or long term, we invite you to reach out to us on our website. There's a letter of interest there that you can sign, or you can reach out to me directly or to Sherry Reyes directly. The second component are employers, right? So we're seeking to partner with employers who are interested in learning about the benefits of covering psychedelic assisted therapy and who want to make sure that their employees and their families are going to have access to these effective treatments. Already, I want to give a shout out to Jeremy Dahls, whose company Pulse Insights is actually the first employer, possibly in the world, who has approached us and is interested in covering psychedelic therapies. So kudos to Jeremy, and also to David Bronner. So Bronner's will also be one of our founding employer groups. And the interest from employer groups has started to flow towards us. So we're collecting letters of interest from multiple employer groups, and we definitely want to connect with more. So if you're aware of any employers, please send them our way. This is how it works. It's actually a community that gets this done together. The other 2 component parts, the next one is medical policy. So we're building medical policy, starting with ketamine-assisted therapy. So this is policy that essentially says how psychedelic therapies will be covered. And we're doing this in collaboration with an expert panel. Our goal is to build these medical policies for the successive therapies and then to open source those medical policies so that the larger carriers can actually learn how to cover these treatments. The goal is to expedite, right? So we want to facilitate this being available through all insurance plans. And finally, we are fundraising, and we're currently raising $2 million in debt via recoverable grants or loans to Anthea to help us create our core infrastructure and roll out our ketamine coverage product. This will set the stage for us to cover MDMA-assisted therapy, and we're seeking 5 million more. We will need 5 million more. So 5 million in commitments that will allow us to launch MDMA-assisted therapy benefit coverage at national scale. So all of that is underway. The last thing I'll say is how grateful we are that we are able to work in close collaboration with some of the other infrastructure projects that you may hear about today, the National Certification Board, the Professional Association, and so forth, in order to really create a coordinated system level implementation of psychedelic healthcare that will be coherent to the existing healthcare system. So that is a privilege and something that we're honored to be able to help with. And we're grateful to the BPRG community for your support, your care, your love, and to MAPS, who are working with very, very closely in their commercialization strategy, and together with this community, with MAPS, with other psychedelic communities across the country, we will create safe, affordable access to psychedelic therapies for all who can benefit. And we're so grateful to be here with you all today. So, thank you.
Many, many thanks, Leah. Amazing what you're doing. It's fabulous to hear an update like that. Thank you. So I'm going to take a little risk and put you on the spot. You can always say no. David Esselman was going to give us an update on the credentialing process, and his internet is not working where he is. So he's had to let me know he can't. So if you want to give a few sentences, great. If not, we can move on.
Anne, are you asking me to give a few sentences?
Yes, please.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, you mentioned it, so I thought maybe you could just tell people a little bit more about what's going on with the credentialing process.
Yeah, Certainly. So the certification board, this is a national professional certification board that will be an accredited body to certify psychedelic therapy practitioners. This group has heard about this entity multiple times. We're doing it incredibly well. So we are in the process, and soon there will likely be an announcement of the initial board. So there's been a very formal, thoughtful process to create nominations for the formal board. And we anticipate that that will be announced in the near future. So the nominations the electors have sent in their nominees, and that is well underway. I'd say a very inclusive and democratic process for what is appropriate for this entity. And I think the other piece of that is that let's see what else would be salient. I wasn't prepared to speak about this, but there is an interim board in place, and that interim board is tasked with setting up the core infrastructure, the business infrastructure for the board itself, the 501c3 and so on, and ensuring that the board is appropriately funded so that it can function properly to help launch the new clinical specialty of psychedelic therapy. So I think that that's the best that I can do on the spot, and look forward to hearing more from David in terms of what specifics he'd like to share.
Yeah, I don't think he'll be able to do that today. So thank you.
Next time, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, and the next person I'm not sure is on, and I may call on you again, and that's Alex Cardenas, who was head of the midwife process that Jeremy Delnos kept us up to date. And Alex is supposed to come on, and maybe you are on, Alex, but I don't see your name, to introduce us to the launching of the American Psychedelic Practitioners Association. Alex?
That is very strange.
I know,
I'm
excited about this. So Alex was also in our cohort at the CPTR. So
we may come on later. Why don't you just hold off until the end of it, and then maybe Leah can speak if Alex.
yeah, can you reach?
Yes, I'll do that. I'll reach out to him because that's unusual. Yep.
Yeah, with the time change, maybe, I don't know, but great if you can reach out to him. Thank you, Leah. So the next person I'd like to call on is Bob Kaufman, Dr. Bob Kaufman, who we had the pleasure of getting to know at our last in-person BPRG meeting. So Bob's a retired Navy captain, a psychiatrist, and an acupuncturist. He was the former chief of clinical operations of the National Intrepid Center of Excellence at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. He's a graduate from 2020 CPTR program, and he's now working in the nonprofit world, aiding veterans and their families. And he recently testified in front of the US Congress about the use of psychedelics to help vets. So Bob, we are looking forward to hearing about that experience, please.
Thank you, Anne, and it's always nice seeing you and working with you, and hello, Shippen, and greetings, everyone. So I was asked to present, or at least to appear on a panel. It really wasn't a testimony. It was actually a panel discussion before the House Committee on Mental Health. And this was convened by Representative Tim Ryan, Democrat from Ohio, in anticipation of two bills that in a bipartisan spirit, he and Representative Dan Crenshaw from Texas are going to introduce later this summer. And if you will, this panel discussion was a opportunity under the guise of, quote, discussing alternative therapies for PTSD. And nowhere did the setup for this panel discussion include the word psychedelic. However, with myself and John Lebecki, and of course, as you know, John has a very remarkable recovery story to tell about MDMA. It was very clear that our panel discussion was specifically about MDMA. In fact, that's why I was asked to be the, if you will, the subject matter expert on MDMA for various members as well as staff. And this panel discussion is actually, Representative Ryan wants this to be the first of 3 or 4 panel discussions over the next few months. The panel discussion that I contributed to was MDMA. There will be subsequent panel discussions on Ibogaine, MDMA, 5-MeO-DMT, and psilocybin, which coincidentally are the 4 medicines that the language of the bill specifically supports. And I can share with you the very rough language of the bill, because the bill hasn't been introduced yet, but the language has been carefully crafted. And what this bill, this bipartisan bill, will do is to provide grants to both the VA and the DoD. The proposed language for the VA component is Saving Veterans Lives with Psychedelic Therapy Act of 2021, and the proposed language and proposed bill for the DoD is the Defense Psychedelic Mental Health Research Act of 2021. And what these 2 bills, if they're passed, and again, this is all very preliminary, this is why we had these quote panel discussions, if you will, preparatory, shaping the beach, before the attack efforts, was to educate staffers and members about the need for alternative forms of healing. So these bills actually provide $12.5 million for 2021 to each of the DoD and VA, and $12.5 million to 2020 for 2022. So it's a $50 million bill altogether. And this grant program is actually, to be eligible to be a recipient of a grant, the eligible entity needs to be either conducting or planning on conducting or conducting phase 2 clinical trials for PTSD, either individual or group. And the language specifically says using MDMA, psilocybin, ibogaine, or 5-MeO. And importantly, the bill goes further, which, as you can imagine, was crafted in part by MAPS, but the bill goes further to also authorize grant money to train practitioners in the treatment of PTSD using these medicines. Importantly, again, this has MAPS DNA all over it, but in addition to the grants being for federal agencies and academic institutions, the grant money is also for nonprofits. And so that should really open things up if these bills are passed. Again, these Shaping Fires are preparatory talks that we're doing. And I will say that the feedback from our maiden presentation before the Congressional Caucus on Mental Health went very, very well. Of course, John Lebecki is incredibly compelling. His story is really moving, and so our strategy is really to have a individual whose life has been saved, who suffered tremendous PTSD from each of those respective medicines, and a discussant like me, to be able to talk about how and why it works and answer some of the questions that staffers may have. And then again, there's some additional language to allow active duty members not to be penalized for their participation in these studies, which they really can't be penalized, but there's always, there's so much stigma again around Schedule 1, particularly psychedelic. So keep your fingers crossed. Again, this is all very preliminary, but it is really reflective of what's going on in Texas with Secretary Perry, and California and Massachusetts and Oregon. And so this is finally some movement at the federal level.
Ooh. Thank you, Bob. Fabulous to hear this. And thank you for all you're doing to help move this ahead.
Thank you.
That's great. I feel like I need a deep breath. So I'm looking to see if Alex Cardenas has joined us. Were you able to find him, Leah?
Unfortunately, no. So we'll hope he is okay.
We hope he's okay, yes. And we'll definitely have him on the next time. And I think, is there anything you want to say about that group, Leah? I know
No, I don't want to steal his thunder. I think that it would be great to have David and Alex back so they can, share both of those infrastructure projects.
Great. Is there a website people could check out maybe? So
there is a website, so we'll post that in the chat.
that would be great, because I think people definitely would like to know more.
Okay, I'll take care of that.
Thank you, Leah. Then this comes out of one of my chat rooms. I had a wonderful conversation in both chat rooms, or breakout rooms. And I put Christina Soriano on the spot, and she offered to give us an update. She's the executive director for the Women's Visionary Council. And so Christina, if you're willing to give us an update, and we all know that I just asked you a few minutes ago, this is not a formal update, but I think it'd be fun for people to hear what you're doing with the Women's Visionary Council. I'm not sure how many people even know what that is, so it'd be fun to learn about that. Christina? Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Anne, for the opportunity. I joined the board of the Women's Visionary Council in September, and then in April, Annie Oak and the board had appointed me as executive director. So the Women's Visionary Council started in 2007 out of the realization that women's voices need to be uplifted in psychedelic spaces. And since its inception, I feel like it's been we feel that it's been very successful. And now we're extending our reach to people of color. And so our mission is it's a nonprofit organization that supports the work of visionary women, healers, scholars, educators, and artists whose efforts contribute to health education and cultural enhancement of their communities and the world. And so we support this work through events and grants. So we're a grant giving and grant receiving organization. Our most well-known event is called the Women's Visionary Congress. And we've been holding these conferences since 2007 with a brief hiatus. And so in these congresses, they're mostly women led, and just really speaking to the work of these psychedelic spaces and what we offer. So the update is that we have an upgraded community site. It's more than a website. It's a community space, a community portal. We've been working on it for the past year and a half, and we're excited that it will actually launch this Saturday, July 17th. In this site, you can make your own user profile where you can give direct messaging. There's forums, a calendar, you can make downloads. It's a very rich, robust site. Most exciting is we have a presenters gallery where the past Congress presenters have their videos uploaded to the site so we can view them. And Anne Shulgin made a beautiful video on the work of the shadow. And it's definitely worth seeing. So I just wanted to thank you, Anne, for giving me the opportunity to give this update about the Women's Missionary Council. And I'll put the website in the chat. It's still the old site, but then on Saturday, it will switch over to the community forum.
Great.
Fabulous.
That's really great, Christina. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, so what a wonderfully rich array of projects going on all over the country. Thank you, everyone, for your updates and everyone for being involved with the BPRG. We now have a little bit of a break. So get up, move around, because we want to be wide awake and ready for a very interesting presentation. If you can come back a little before 2, we'll want to start promptly at 2. Anyone who wants to stay on and chat with each other, you're more than welcome to do that. But I think quite a few people need to get up and move around. So do whatever you need to do. And we'll see you back a little before 2. Thank you, everyone.
Great.
Stop video. Such a vibrant community, and just watching it all happen in real time is really wonderful. We're making plans now for our September 19th meeting. We're trying to figure out a way to do a hybrid of some in person, some virtual. We'll let you know more about that. But let's focus on today. So I have the pleasure now of introducing my husband, Shippen Page. He helped me found the BPRG. He's been the BPRG's lawyer, treasurer, secretary. Basically, he keeps us going. And we're very, very grateful to him for all that he does. I asked him today to be the moderator with Brian because of his longstanding curiosity in this field and also in history, and also because of his fabulous intellect. I thought he and Brian would have a good time together. So I'm going to pass it over to Shippen and let him take over now.
Thank you, Anne, and welcome all, and welcome, Brian. You and I have spoken, and so I'm hoping this will be an informal conversation. I'm sure many of the people on this call have read your book, admired your work, heard your podcasts, been familiar with Andrew Sullivan, but can we bring Brian into a split screen so we can have a conversation? Is that possible, Sherry? If not, I'm happy just to do it on a screen-by-screen basis. But in any event, so my honor is to frame a discussion with Brian, whose book, The Immortality Key, The Secret History of the Religion with No Name, dovetails so beautifully with the work that has been reported on this call, and also the zeitgeist that's transforming this country, state by state, city by city, church by church, institution by institution. So Brian, I'll just frame this by saying that you are a Jesuit-trained scholar, and you've been invited by your preceptors to challenge the basis of your faith. I'm not sure when they unleashed your intellect, they would have known where you were going. But as I did, you left Philadelphia and you sought broader realms, first in the legal profession, but more importantly, as an amateur sleuth, somebody who's not trained in medicine or trained in science, somebody who's been unearthing the remarkable history of the religion with no name. And so I wondered if you just give us a little bit of a background so those who are not familiar with your work can be brought into the conversation. But I also want to leave a lot of time for questions because there are about 80 people on this call, many of whom far more erudite than I am. And I'm sure they're going to want to be asking you questions. And so I'm going to basically cover a few topics and then we'll open up for conversation. But give us a background, give us a little bit of a foundation of how in the world you got here from St. Joseph's Prep, Brown University, and a real fascination with what's going on here.
Thank you, Shippen, and thanks to Anne for having me. If my voice is a little hoarse, it's because I actually caught a cold in New Mexico. I was in Santa Fe for the first time in my life this past week, so yet another synchronicity in this magical mystery tour, which is super strange. We can delve into that later. Here I stand. This is my 13th year of exploration into psychedelics and the mysteries. It all began back in 2007, 2008. Reading about some of the first psilocybin experiments coming out of Hopkins and all of Roland and Bill's work down there, who I'm sure folks are familiar with, Roland Griffiths and Bill Richards and Bob Jesse, who really got the modern iteration of clinical studies started. It's been over 20 years ago. So it hit my radar in 2007, and I immediately started thinking about the ancient world and have spent the past 13 years trying to answer two very big questions, which weren't my questions, just following up on questions that had been asked in the 1950s, the 1960s, and controversially in the 1970s. Number one, did the ancient Greeks use drugs to find God? Which in and of itself is a big question because it calls into question the foundations of Western civilization. But number two, and more intriguingly maybe for this Jesuit-trained Catholic boy, if there were psychedelics involved in some of the ancient Greek mysteries, right, going back 2,500 years, or maybe longer, did some of that technology make its way into what I call Paleo-Christianity, which is that bizarre period of Christianity in the first 300 years after Jesus's death, when it was largely an illegal cult, and difficult to explain how this cult transformed the Roman Empire into a Christianized Roman Empire in only a couple of centuries. The scholar Bart Ehrman has called that the greatest cultural transformation in the history of Western civilization. We sit here in the year 2021. That's Anno Domini, if you're Jesuit trained, which is the year of our Lord. So like it or not, we're all kind of marching to Jesus. So for those with faith, without faith, it's just whatever happened 2,000 years ago is one of these big turning points in Western civilization. And I've always been obsessed with trying to figure out what was really going on. And it started with a look at the ancient Greek. And because I'm not a scientist or trained in medicine, I started talking to scientists and folks with an expertise in ancient pharmacology, trying to figure out what was actually happening in the ancient world. And that pretty much brought us to where we are today. So the book came out last September, and it's been a whirlwind ever since.
Wow, and the two things strike me, Brian. One is that you have an unusual background in Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, and so you could actually decipher. I read your book and saw you in the Vatican Library translating 17th, 16th, 15th century Latin, and then also your association with Andrew Coe and archaeochemistry and archaeobotany, two terms that I'd never put together, archaeochemistry, but these techniques have been incredibly important in aiding you to make these discoveries. Could you talk a little bit about those two worlds, the
Sure.
language and the technology?
Well, those two worlds, I'm not just saying this for the audience or for you, but those two worlds meet in Boston. Boston is a gigantic character in my book, in lots of studies on this. Andrew Coe, who you mentioned, has been an archaeochemist at MIT for several years. And the notion of archaeochemistry in and of itself is almost a misnomer because it's equal parts science and humanities. So there's the chemistry aspect of going into these relics, these artifacts from the ancient world, and trying to scrape out organic evidence to see if there's actually drugs in these ancient vessels. The chemistry, the botany is a big part of it. And Andrew's been doing that on his own dime, on his own time, through a project he's been running partly through MIT for many, many years. But where the rubber meets the road is how you interpret this data. So even if you get an archaeochemical hit, even if you find ergot in an ancient chalice, or you find some other kind of visionary plant, what do you do with that? Well, you have to look to the language. You got to look to the anthropology even. And this is what textualists and classicists have been trained to do. I wanted to be a classics professor. I sold out and went to law school instead. But one of my mentors, I mentioned him in the book, is a guy named Greg Naj, who I sometimes refer to as the LeBron James of the classics estate. He's the director of the Center for Hellenic Studies, Harvard's premier study of Hellenic antiquity here in Washington, DC. but Greg also teaches up in Boston, obviously. He's been a staple of the Harvard Classics department for decades. And when I brought him this idea a few years ago, he didn't laugh me out of the room, which was, I mean, it was a gigantic encouragement towards going out and asking these questions. And I just, it's funny, I found that encouragement time and time again. What was controversial, maybe even unspeakable 42 years ago, when some of these ideas were being bandied about, is not really the case anymore. And again, Boston has just played a gigantic role in this story.
Boston, of all places, one of the more conservative places on the planet. But never mind that. I want to shift now. This is going to be somewhat jumpy because your book is so broad in its reach, but I'm trying to get little tendrils that folks might want to latch onto. The very first preface in the book is, if you die before you die, then you won't die when you die, which is an amazing struggle with the concept of death. And it informs so much of this work, no matter what the modality, as Bob Kaufman was talking about before, whether it's 5-MeO or psilocybin or MDMA or any one of these. So could you tell me why you put that phrase at the very beginning of the book? How does that inform the reader?
Because I think that is the immortality key. I think the conscious culturing of a near-death experience, and in as terrifying a way as possible, so that you actually feel like you're dying, is part of the key to these ancient mysteries. And I think something like a near-death experience, potentially facilitated by psychedelics, probably facilitated by myriad other techniques, what Eliade called the archaic techniques of ecstasy. I think this is a gigantic part of archaic Christianity, of the pagan mysteries that precede it, of the fertility cults you see in the ancient Mediterranean and ancient Near East for millennia before Christ. And so people often ask me how a psychedelic virgin could write a whole book on psychedelics. And my answer is that I do not think that the key to some of these mysteries is drugs per se, but drugs as the facilitators of these extraordinary states of awareness. And what it comes down to me is that beautiful Greek phrase, an Bethanis, prin Bethanis, denta Bethanis, otan Bethanis. And you see that at St. Paul's Monastery on Mount Athos in Greece. So it's been carried over, at least into Orthodox Christianity. And I think it harkens back to the very first days of the Christian faith. I think it precedes the Christian faith and goes back to the ancient Greek world, particularly the pre-Socratics, this concept of just laying down and dying. And when you lay down and die, and it can happen just with sleep deprivation, light deprivation, going into a cave for 3 days, by the praxis of incubation, for some reason, it sends us into these altered states where the gods and goddesses speak. This is how the Greeks talked about it. And there's something very peculiar about these states of awareness.
Yeah. Well, in your book, you talk about the sacrament and the Last Supper, and then we're talking, you and Andrew Sullivan had an amazing conversation where you were talking about the sacrament as a placebo. And I thought to myself, that got my attention. And for the number of practicing Catholics who simply don't believe in transubstantiation, that was really, the whole thing is people searching for deeper meaning and finding that the institution isn't meeting their needs. And that exploration, you've talked with so many Catholic scholars and how that affects your thinking about the direct connection with the divine that's possible through these medicines.
Yes.
If I could have a few moments of your thoughts on that, Brian, would be, I think, enlightening for those listening.
Okay, well, again, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. If I mention it as a placebo, I just want to say I still consider myself a Catholic, and the job of a good Catholic is to go ad fontes, like the humanists, to go to the source, to try and figure out what is going on with this religion. And I'm really just paying homage to that Pew poll that came out a few years ago. Something like almost 70% of American Catholics do not believe in transubstantiation, which is that notion of the ordinary bread and wine becoming the supernatural blood and body of Christ. Literally, right? That is the promise of the Gospels, and particularly in John's Gospel, that by consuming that bread and wine, you are consuming Christ and thereby becoming Christ yourself. I spent a whole chapter on John's Gospel talking about this. So that is the promise of Christianity, is to become Christ through the sacrament of the Eucharist. We have these tools, right? The promise of Christianity is not to go in a cave. and just lay down. We have this whole liturgical service. We have the Eucharist, which Pope Francis himself has called essential to salvation. I mean, what is Christianity without this Eucharist? And so when you start to investigate what that would have meant to someone who spoke Greek in the 1st century AD or the 2nd century, you begin to bump up against these mystery cults. And the concept of drinking the blood of a god was not a foreign concept. You know, Jesus wasn't the first person to float this idea. And when you start to investigate what blood meant and what these sacramental theologies meant to the ancient Greeks, you do bump up against different kinds of wine. I call it the biggest unanswered question of the past 2,000 years. When we think about the Last Supper, what kind of wine was it? And you know, we have no archaeological evidence for that chalice. It's why it's assumed this mythic quality. Why Indiana Jones goes after the Holy Grail, because we don't have the Holy Grail.
Right.
You know, but I've always been fascinated about trying to find that cup and finding out what was in it. And so we have proxy chalices all around the ancient world where we can try and figure out what wine meant to people at the time. And so I won't get into the details, but half of my book is basically about that. And you know, I struggle. I'm struggling with my faith. I'm struggling with the marriage of religion and science. And weirdly, psychedelics sit in this space where I think they act as a really compelling bridge between the sciences and people of faith.
Boy, your reach is so broad, Brian. So now I'm going to bring you back to Eleusis. I'm going to bring you back to the fact that people prepared for this. They went there. They were under the supervision of very highly trained women with these medicines, these brews. And so that's one foundational piece. And then we fast forward 1600 years, and we've got, you know, the Inquisitions, where the Vatican is keeping careful records of how they're eliminating grandmothers, mothers, and daughters, and the brews that they concoct. But they're keeping records of this. And so my sense is, as you look at the world that you've been exploring, where are women, and why are women so excluded from the Catholic hierarchy? And this is a continuation, it seems to me, on the war on drugs, which is a lot of women are targeted. So I'm just musing.
Okay.
Share the muse with me.
I'll share the muse. Andra moena pa musa. I'm invoking the muse. So much of the book is about women and drugs, let's face it. And I didn't set out to write a book about women and drugs, but the more I looked at ancient pharmacology, the more you bump up against women. So, you know, you talk about Eleusis, it was sort of the spiritual capital of the ancient Greek world, 13 miles northwest of Athens. It receives initiates like Plato to Cicero to Marcus Aurelius, all the best and brightest. But before them, Eleusis was exclusively a women's rite of initiation, which is very strange. Men were only invited after the fact. And even then, it was largely female priestesses, together with a male hierophant, and these hereditary families, of course. But it was female priestesses who were very heavily involved in the sacramental ceremoniality, I'll call it. And then if you look at the rites of Dionysus, separate, somewhat similar to Eleusis, you have the magic potion of wine. It's women. Women are the primary female devotees of the god of ecstasy and mystical rapture, Dionysus. And at the beginning of Christianity, if you go down into the catacombs under the streets of Rome, you'll see beautiful frescoes of women celebrating what looks to be some kind of proto-Eucharistic ritual ceremony. They are consecrating the wine. They are holding the wine aloft. People are shouting out Greek words like agape, miske mi agape, mix it up for me agape, which is a beautiful Greek word for love. And throughout Paul's letters, you see women being invoked time and time again, particularly in Rome. Mary, Tryphina, Tryphosa, Persis. So again, without getting into the details, women are a huge part of these ancient initiation ceremonies. And what is a witch if not someone with profound expertise over the natural kingdom? And we think about our Disney movies and these witches standing over these gobbledygook green cauldrons. I mean, they are the people who know their plants and herbs. These are the people who can heal, who can harm, who can slay, who can sanctify, and under the right conditions just might offer you one of these beatific visions. So it's kind of this parallel story of Western civilization as women and drugs, and this profound role they played in the retention of these sacred pharmacopoeias.
And you have highlighted it so superbly in this book. So forgive me, Brian, for jump shifting again, because I want to give some latitude for those dialing in. But I'm struck that Michael Pollan in his book, I mean, How to Change Your Mind, now you with the Immortality Key, are really creating a canon which is covering a lot of different aspects of this work. One thing I wanted to point out was the importance of that one experience with Roland Griffith as the most important, or amongst the 5 most important spiritual experiences. And Michael also creates something, in my opinion, of a misperception that if you go through this experience with a trained guide, it can be one and done. You're just going to see the world in a different way. And that's not how I understand this work, certainly in the healing sphere. So I'm trying to sort of compare the spiritual access with the healing sphere and wonder if you can sort of bridge that, because Michael has obviously been instrumental in catapulting this work to the public consciousness.
Yeah, and Michael's a friend, and I love his book, and his work has really catapulted this onto, if not the national, then maybe even the world stage. It's just incredible what's happened over the past couple of years, and goes to show you the power of good writing. I don't know. I feel like we're caught somewhere between, in the US, we're caught somewhere between FDA-approved therapeutics and First Amendment protected sacraments. And I don't know how that's going to play out over the next decade, but it is going to play out. On page 1 of my book, you know, I'm interested in mystical experience. So, you know, this stuff obviously has therapeutic benefits, from anxiety to depression, you know, end of life distress. It's amazing how many different conditions can be addressed by psychedelics: PTSD, alcoholism, nicotine addiction, etc. And I'm sure everyone here is well versed in all of that. But my question is why? Like, why does this stuff work? And it's not in every case, but you know, I mentioned Dinah Baser, for example, who's one of these volunteers in the NYU Hopkins end of life study from, it's almost now 5 years ago. And she talks about, as an atheist, you know, with this cancer diagnosis, her one and only dose, she talks about being bathed in God's love. It's page 1 of my book, because it just strikes me as so strange. It's not every case, but you know, it seems like people have profound, meaningful, sometimes spiritual, sometimes religious, sometimes mystical experiences on this stuff. And again, it reminds me of what we used to call the mystery cults. In some cases, Eleusis, for example, was one and done. You went there once in your life for this visionary, epic initiation into the rites of Demeter and Persephone. Dionysus was different. It was a little more frequent. It wasn't this once in a lifetime encounter. Early Christianity obviously is different. And so, you know, there's this whole world of, you know, how often should this medicine, this technology be availed of? And I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know how this is going to play out, but I know a lot of people with ontological questions, existential angst, what we sometimes call the healthy normals, can certainly benefit from this. And I don't know what that looks like, but I'm curious and speculating.
Well, it's so wonderful. So I'm going to ask you a final question, then I'm going to open it up to the chat. And that is that now academia and big organizations like the Mass General and NYU and Stanford and Berkeley and all are getting involved in this, but you've got a particular interest at Harvard. And would you like to share a little bit of what you might like to see happen at Harvard?
I would love to. And I guess it's at least partially on the public record. Our friend Michael was on the Joe Rogan show about a week ago, and they were talking about the ancient mysteries and mentioned my book, and Michael kindly mentioned that Harvard is picking this up. There have been some wonderful conversations, again, back to Boston as this main character. I think there's a need in the scholarship to harmonize the hard sciences, like we've been talking about, with the social sciences, with the humanities, right? I'm a humanities guy, and so, you know, all those degrees that don't really produce income-paying jobs, like classics and linguistics and theology. I think there's a real need, and there's some interest in uniting studies at the Harvard Divinity School, for example, with what's been happening thanks to Dick and Jerry and others at MGH and Harvard Medical School. And there's a biochemist there, Steve Haggerty, whose work I find just fascinating. And he is one of these history nerds like me, who is obsessed with Richard Evans Schultes, the premier ethnobotanist from Harvard. I mean, Harvard just has this incredible legend and lore around psychedelic studies. And I think that by combining all this interest from the divinity school to the medical school to now the law school, you folks probably saw that news last week or a week and a half ago, to the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. It's just, the interest is all over campus. And I think there's a real need to coordinate some of these studies and produce some really compelling scholarship that the world has never seen before.
I completely agree. And I'm eager to put in the comment, Brian, that you are still a virgin. And at some point in the game, you may consider this. I'm not asking for a comment, but I just wanted to say that it seems as though there might be some real insights that you could gain, but I'm not going to go there publicly.
It's a work in progress. I'm still a virgin though.
That's it. So I'm going to turn to the chat now. I've got monovision because I had cataract surgery, and so sometimes I can't see what these chats are. So my good wife Ann is going to happy. Here's from Sarah Breuer. Sarah, do you want to?
Dylan. She goes by Dylan.
Oh, Sarah Dillon. Forgive me. Do you want to ask the question directly of Brian?
You've got several questions.
You've got several questions. Synthesize them.
You
into
know
one.
what? Yeah,
51.
I will synthesize them into one. So there's a vast body of scholarship on the mystery religions, pre-Christian, during Christian, post-Christian, whole thing. Can you name a few of the scholars of that field who have influenced your work? And also, just because I unfortunately didn't hear of your book until just now, what does your book provide that that previous scholarship has not?
Awesome, great question. When it comes to ancient mystery cults, it begins and ends with Walter Burkert. You might know. Harvard University Press put out his Grekische Religion der Archaischen Klassischen Epoche in 1985 as Greek religion.
Yeah, pretty old.
Pretty old. It starts with Burkert. It goes into Karenyi. I'm fascinated by the scholarship of Peter Kingsley, Ramsey McMullen at Yale, who talks about the intersection of these mysteries with early Christianity. I'm not gonna bore everybody else. But I think what I present in the book is two hard pieces of data. And so you're familiar with the notion of the psychedelic hypothesis from The Road to Eleusis, which was released in 1978 by Wasson, Huffman, and Ruck. They claimed that ergotized beer was somehow involved in these ancient mysteries, no science to prove it. There was an archaeological...
And also nobody really arguing against it, you know?
Well, it severely impacted Carl's career. So there was, whether or not. So, I'm not saying.
I mean, over the last 30 years, it has been controversial.
Right, not much data to support or deny it. So in any event, long story short, there was an archaeological site in Spain dating to the classical period from the 2nd century BC, where they did in fact find microscopic remains of ergot in a tiny chalice. It was published in Catalan about 20 years ago, and just never really saw the light of day or made its way to academic conferences. So I present that, and another piece of scholarship from 20 years ago, wine from Pompeii, seemingly spiked with visionary compounds and lizards, frogs, and toads. That again, just kind of went unacknowledged and undebated. Just fascinating archaeobotanical finds.
Yeah.
Proof of concept for the larger study of archaeochemistry and what's hiding out in these ancient chalices. That's all.
That is so fascinating. So it'd be fair to say that your book provides a few additional pieces of archaeological hard data to back up the common knowledge that mystery religions, some of them used psychedelic materials.
Yeah, I want to see the evidence. Exactly. I'm interested in archaeobotany, archaeochemistry.
So you hit the archaeobotany spot.
Yeah.
All right, that's awesome. I got to check it out.
Great.
Thank you. I just need to know what general way to tunnel.
Got you.
Thanks for your patience.
Sure. Yeah. Pam Stockton, you had a question that you framed to everybody. I'm not sure it's a question or a comment. Would you like to elaborate on that?
It was really just a comment. I was responding to Brian's statement that he thinks the notion of dying before you die is the immortality key. And I was just commenting on the first saying of the Gospel of Thomas that says pretty much the same thing. Yeah. Whoever discovers the meaning of these words will not taste death.
Yeah. Thank you, Pam. I welcome any questions or comments in the chat or raise your hand, so we can take advantage of this opportunity with Brian. here we have Penelope, you have something about the question about Gilgamesh and the herb of immortality. Do you want to elaborate on that, Penelope?
Yes, I'm not a scholar. I'm a Jungian analyst, so I sort of dabble in scholarly things. But I was thinking about the Epic of Gilgamesh and your work. And that's one of the oldest epics, written epics. And in that story, an old couple has the herb of immortality. And I believe Gilgamesh gets it and he's rowing across the river to take it home. And I believe it's a snake that takes it and jumps into the water, or slithers. And what I'm feeling collectively, symbolically, is that this is part of a deep dive to bring up the herb of immortality that many of us have been working on in different ways. But your work, which I deeply enjoyed, especially your reading, beautiful. The vibration of your language is fantastic.
Thank you.
But thank you. I was raised Catholic, but I would consider myself a mystic, and I can confirm. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless. There's lots of Catholic mystics out there, hunting the herb of immortality.
Yes.
Yeah, I wish I had more chapters to dive into the Sumerian and Akkadian and Babylonian traditions. I kind of skirt through it on a couple chapters talking about the Holy Land. But you find this imagery time and again, and you find it across the Indo-European languages. You find it in Sanskrit and the Vedas. This concept of soma, which I kind of reference only in passing, but again, this notion of sacramental theology, that we don't just go out into a field and meditate or think our way to salvation. Sometimes you do, and that's incredible. But these sacraments are mentioned. The herb of immortality is mentioned in a deep tradition that certainly even precedes the Sumerians, and a tradition that even precedes the Vedas, and certainly precedes the Greco-Roman traditions or the Christian or Jewish. This concept of looking to nature as an ally in that hunt for salvation, it's as old as recorded history itself, and far beyond that. In the book, I kind of artificially started 12,000 years ago at the agricultural revolution, because it's apparently when we start brewing beer, and most of my book is about beer and wine. But with dental calculus analysis and all these new scientific techniques, we could push the human relationship with drugs back tens or hundreds of thousands of years. And my hope is before our species. I mentioned one study about Neanderthal teeth that show the presence of medicinal compounds like yarrow and chamomile going back 50,000 years. We are just scratching the surface on this stuff. My friend Lee Berger, the paleoanthropologist in South Africa, he thinks that he can detect the diet of Australopithecus sediba going back 2 million years. We know what people were eating 2 million years ago, or at least we're just beginning to know. This stuff fascinates me, again, because I probably should have studied science instead of ancient language.
You are studying science, Brian. I know that. So, as any good publisher knows, once you've got a bestseller in your hands, you turn to the author and say, "What's next, Brian?" So you've got to be working on something which is going to trigger a lot more conversation.
Yes. Yeah. There's a couple of things I'm working on. I won't talk about it too much, but it's fair to say it's within the same genre. I think Michael got caught by that bug as well. I'm just beginning his recent book that came out last week. For some reason, this stuff just grabs you. There's a lot more juice to squeeze here. And again, I do say to skeptics, and I myself consider myself a curious skeptic, the immortality key really is just proof of concept. We've never taken a systematic look through these ancient artifacts and through these samples we've collected to see what's in there. It's a science that is relatively new, and which means it's full of possibility and excitement. So I'm trying to follow that story and see where it goes.
Well, I'm eager to talk to you offline about the interest of the Vatican and all these antiquities that lie within the Vatican's control, and your remarkable ability to win the trust of senior Vatican officials in getting access as a quote unquote layperson into these, which could be deeply unsettling to figures in authority. So I would love, I don't have the time to do it online here, Brian, but I want to turn to some of the questions in the chat. Jim, I think I'm pronouncing it right, Shofi? Is that correct, Jim? Do you want to answer the question?
That's right,
Brian?
Chipper.
Do you want to ask your question to Brian?
Well, I was thinking, I was wondering what you thought about this hypothesis that the reason those mystical type experiences are so healing is that they reveal the fact that something, whether you call it God or whether you don't call it anything at all, there is something of real and profound value that actually exists and that you can actually make contact with. So it refutes hopelessness. And I think there's so much hopelessness. At least in my case, I was, associated with depression and anxiety. So I think that that's a really healing potential, is to have that mystical type experience and discover a greater reality. But what do you think?
Yeah, no answers there, but this is what I think about 23 hours a day. And again, the reason I'm interested in psychedelics is because of how that literature and the testimony dovetails with the literature on near-death experiences and mystical experience. I spent a long time in my teen years and 20s studying the Catholic mystics. And again, one thing that comes across time and again is this notion of dying before dying. And we can't prove it as an objective reality, but when people enter into this space, whether it's Meister Eckhart or Teresa de Avila or John of the Cross, or Teilhard de Chardin, and all these Catholics I was reading about as a young man, the notion of discovering that divine spark just wells up again and again. And we can't prove that it exists. We can't prove that it's real. We can't prove there's an afterlife. But to cut to the chase, what strikes me is this noetic sense that, as William James would call it, from the varieties of religious experience. Whether it's objectively true or not, it seems real. As a matter of fact, whatever's encountered in these visionary states, people will report seems like the realest thing they've ever experienced, which is really weird. This was Gordon Wasson's very first reaction to his psilocybin journey in the 1950s, when he writes about in 1957 that our ordinary seeing is this imperfect version of everyday life suddenly became crisp and super detailed, just etched into his memory. And he was convinced that whatever he was experiencing had some kind of relationship to the ancient mysteries and Plato's archetypical world, that the real world exists out there. What we experience here every day is somehow a lesser version of that, the allegory of the cave, etc. This stuff just pops up again and again. So we can't prove it, but subjectively, people have these incredibly profound experiences that stay with them for a lifetime. And that's my real interest.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. Ron, Miss, you also had a comment, Ron, Miss, about the Catholic Church.
I unmute myself. Hi, Brian. Really great to hear you describing your book, which I loved reading. And my question has to do with, as the traditions of women creating these potentially creating these psychoactive beverages and leading these ceremonies is replaced by a religion with male priests who, go through the Eucharistic ceremony, but it's a placebo, and the individual churchgoers are no longer directly receiving the psychoactive beverage and potentially communing directly with God. Anyways, that's the background. My question is, can this be seen as an effort by the church to essentially insert itself as an intermediary between the individuals and their own experience of the divine? And essentially, I don't know, it's kind of a power move. But now if you want to talk to God, you have to do it through a priest. We'll tithe you 10% as well. So it's essentially, from an historian's perspective, the church as an organization gaining power over people by, like I said, removing their ability to directly have this experience, and they got to go through a priest.
It's a possibility we have to. I mentioned that in the book. That's one reading of the history of the 4th century, which is the suppression of the so-called Gnostic heretical Christian groups which profess direct access to the divine, that to know God is really to know the self, that to know yourself at the deepest level is to know God. Elaine Pagels at Princeton writes a lot about the Gnostic Gospel, some of my favorite scholarship on the topic. It's one reading of the 4th century is that the bureaucracy of the church wasn't interested in unmediated visionary experience. You know, it kind of bleeds into conspiracy theory about what the whole purpose was. The more prosaic explanation is that the all-male patriarchal Roman Empire kind of stepped into the shoes of a Christianized Roman Empire and just kept marching. It's not any more mysterious than that. How many female Roman emperors were there? How many female popes have there been? It's just what happened through history. And some of these female-led house churches, right? Because that's where Christianity was meeting. It was meeting in catacombs, underground, literally, in funerary banquets. It was meeting in private dining rooms. Before there were basilicas and cathedrals, it was private homes, many of which were commandeered by women, right? Women were running the dining rooms and providing the raw materials for these Eucharistic ceremonies. As the basilicas started growing and money started pouring into the church after Constantine, I was just reading Ramsay McMullen this morning on that, Christianity changed. It got big and it got powerful. And it was, you know, it was the religion of the emperors. There was no separation between church and state. And so one patriarchal institution stepped into another. I think it's that simple.
Yeah,
That's helpful, thanks.
yeah. Dick, you want to talk about praction, and I think that's a worthy question.
Sure. I'm unmuted here. Great. So, Brian, first off, it's amazing to me. It's impressive, amazing, and well-deserved, the amount of press and traction that your book has created. But it's also like amazing. You know,
You're the best, Dick.
what's that?
You're the best, man. You're the best.
No. Apparently, the public thinks you're the best. That's how they're but Mike, so the question, and I don't know how much of this you can address now, but the question for you is, what's additional is coming out of it, to the extent that there's anything that you can share with the broader group?
Right. We talked about it briefly, but there seems to be interest in this topic writ large. Let's call it psychedelics with a capital P. But there's interest in this topic in and around Boston. And I think that that's very meaningful because of the history at Harvard and Boston University, which is where Carl Ruck was, still is, by the way. And, I think psychedelics are one of those things that you can have 25 different disciplines weigh in just the beginning of an effort to get somewhere. And so when you look around at some of these other centers, which are doing incredible work, it's largely clinical work or the neuropsychopharmacological work, which we wouldn't be here today without it. And I feel like in the interpretation of these psychedelic states and giant questions about the future of religion, the future of medicine, the future of society, I think there's so many disciplines that can weigh in on this, and not just the classics and linguistics or archaeology or anthropology, but divinity studies and even the biochemists can all kind of get together to try and crack this mysterious nut. And I think what better than a place like Harvard? So I guess without saying too much, there's lots of faculty who are interested in exploring this in a coordinated way from all these different schools at Harvard, which I think is number one, a sign of the times versus 5 years ago. And you know that from your work at MGH, Dick. But I think it's a really encouraging sign to the public that there's a way to talk about and investigate this stuff that is interesting to the public, and we can communicate and language this stuff for the public. In my case, just to demonstrate that history is interesting, and archaeology matter, the humanities matter. Again, all these degrees that don't wind up in well-paying jobs. I mean, this stuff matters. And even if you think about it at a very practical level, if you're interested in the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, I mean, so much of that happens in the integration or making meaning of this stuff. And who better than someone who studied comparative religion or literature for decades to kind of weigh in on this crazy stuff that we see. It's bizarre what happens in these states, and I feel like the more resources we have at our disposal, the better equipped we are to begin managing this, because psychedelics are going to spill into religion, and they're going to spill into medicine. And I think that Michael's new book is only demonstrating the kind of thirst for this material. So I mean, all that said, I'd love to speak offline with folks. who are interested in supporting some of this very interdisciplinary scholarship that is just now getting online. I think it's some of the most exciting times I've seen.
Great, thanks. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Dick. And thanks for your work at the MGH. I mean, all of these major institutions are now being led by people who are getting informed and really seemingly committed to making real progress in this field. So Jonas DiGregorio, you've been our resident translating impetus. And Jonas is in San Francisco. Brian wants to know about the international reach of your work. Jonas, you want to frame your question?
Thank you. Yeah, Brian, nice to connect again. I'm curious if you can share a little bit more about what has been the response, the interest in your book in the rest of the world, if you've been invited to speak at podcasts or events in other countries. And also, as far as you know, if there is any publisher interested in translating your book in other languages. Thank you.
Jonas, grazie per tutti. Good to see you again. It's mainly, honestly, it's mainly been the English-speaking world. For some reason, you get lots of outreach in Canada, Australia, and the UK, obviously. Parts of Latin America, the book is still not in Spanish. So those rights are available, Jonas. There's something happening with the Italian rights that we should talk about, but would love to see this in French and German as well, just because of where the book goes. So the short answer is it's largely the English-speaking world for now. Although I've done podcasts in different countries and things like that, but would love to see more versions of this available where it needs to be.
Great. Thanks for that question, Jonas. That's great. Clemens Bauer-Haas, whom I don't know, but you have a very interesting comment. Would you like to engage Brian with it? Clemens, are you
Sure.
there?
Yes, 1 second.
Sure.
Hello, Brian. Thank you for this meeting. I've been joining these meetings on the meditation side, and I was wondering if you have looked into the similes or parallels that have been explored in the Eastern traditions, like with meditation, deep meditations, like life after death, reincarnation, and all these concepts that have, that are very well known, let's say, for example, in the Buddhist tradition, and link it to your ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I focus largely on the Western context. That's kind of the audience I'm interested in speaking to. But yeah, I mean, I majored in Sanskrit at some point and looked a lot into Buddhism, obviously. It's funny how much of that resonates in the ancient Greek world. Even something as simple as reincarnation. There's a number of Greek words for that, by the way, including palingenesis. I mean, if you read Plato's myth of you're already, stumbling into notions of reincarnation. Pythagoras talks about it. It pops up all throughout the ancient Greco-Roman world. It's even in the New Testament, hints of Jesus having reincarnated as a former prophet. These notions were just all around the ancient Mediterranean, not just in the East, which is why I use the term ancient cultural internet for some of these traditions, how they got into the East. Peter Kingsley does a lot of great work on this. I would highly recommend. He's more eloquent than me. In the Dark Places of Wisdom or Reality, he talks about how some of these Eastern traditions, even shamanic, did make their way from either the steppes of Central Asia or parts further east into the Greco-Roman world. So yeah, it's very difficult to study these traditions without thinking about Buddhism or the Vedas. And this Indo-European net that tied the world together from Iberia to Afghanistan. Especially after the exploits of Alexander the Great, where all these ideas were meeting in the marketplace of Ionia. I think that's the real key here, is in the eastern part of the Greek world. It's where East and West really met, still meets today even, what would become Byzantium in the late antique period. So just beautiful stuff. I wish we had time to go more into it, but I'd love to chat offline.
Great. Thanks for that question.
Thank you very much.
Ron Siegel, why don't you chime in, because you've got a related question.
Yeah, my question is a little bit less historical and a little bit more phenomenological. I'm coming at this as a psychologist. Can you talk a bit about your sense of self-transcendent states or ego dissolution states or death before actual physical death, as they're experienced in theistic contexts that relate to a sense of a personal God, as opposed to what seem to be remarkably similar phenomena, but experienced in a cultural context that it could be Buddhist, it could be a Western scientific context that doesn't posit a personal God and sees it as connection to the universe, all things, the natural world, etc. And how in your studies do you notice the phenomenology of these being different and perhaps their effects on people's lives being different?
Wow. I wish we had a couple hours. That's I mean, that's the question, right? I always think about Joseph Campbell's conversations with Roman Catholic priests, the priest of his youth, talking about the personal God versus a non-personal God. I suppose there's no way to prove the existence of a personal God, he once commented to a priest friend. And what use would be faith if that were the case? At which point they part ways. You find both in the ancient world. It does dovetail with the prior question. Someone like a Neoplatonist like Plotinus talks about the one. Plato talks about the good. Whether that's a personal monotheism or an atheistic impersonal theology or atheology that resonates with some of the Eastern wisdom traditions is up for debate. But you find both in the ancient world. I mean, on the one hand, these ego dissolving states that we find at Eleusis, where technically Demeter and Persephone are the objects of perception, right? You're going there for this face-and-face encounter with the goddess. In some senses, it's also a beatific vision. This is what Karenyi talks about it. And again, I'm not sure if that's a personal beatific vision or an impersonal beatific vision. It's carried over from Christianity, obviously this whole notion, but again, even within Christianity, across history, there are impersonal, non-dual visionary states that Meister Eckhart talks about, and there are very personal encounters with Jesus. If you ask Richard Rohr that question, the great Franciscan friar, he might draw a distinction between Jesus and Christ. So an encounter with the personal Jesus, a manifestation of the Trinity, the Father, God, and Holy Spirit. At the same time, the Christ, the Christos, is this encounter with this ever-present, loving, benevolent force. What do we call that? Is that impersonal? How much of Buddhism or Eastern wisdom can we really find in the New Testament? I think quite a lot, actually. So, I mean, I struggle with that every day, to be quite honest. And I think this is where the religious orders have always come in. In Catholicism, this is the Franciscans and Dominicans and Jesuits will often report on experiences that, to me, seem like that ego dissolving encounter with an impersonal deity in a religion that is dedicated to personal theism. So I'm vamping and not answering your question.
Well, let me push you a little further.
Please.
This is fantastic and fascinating, but if I could push you a little further, because you must have some phenomenological sense of these, and how do they seem to transform people? Do they transform people in different ways? These, even though they intermix and you're seeing all the interrelations over the history of time, to the degree to which people do have these somewhat distinct experiences, do they tend to have different consequences, each one?
That's a great question for like Bill Richards or Matt Johnson and the clinicians. I mean, and I've heard their answers to these questions, and it's not always entirely clear if a highly detailed visionary encounter with a god, goddess, or archetypal entity is somehow different from one of these unitive, non-dual encounters with the isness, right, with the being of beings. They've seen both at Hopkins and NYU over the past 20 years, and we have literature going back to the 50s that talks about this, and we have accounts going back thousands of years. I guess my honest answer is I don't know. I would love to see the data on what produces the outcome that you're looking for. I wonder if you can't find equal meaning in both, or if one encounter of something means something particularly meaningful for somebody in 1 year that one in the next year. And I always think about Diana Baser, who are talking about God. It's not clear to me whether this atheist is talking about a personal or an impersonal God. And I wonder if it even matters. I'd love to ask, I should have asked her more follow-up questions about what she meant by that. The only follow-up question I asked her is why didn't she feel bathed in the love of the cosmos or the love of Mother Nature? And she said that the word God is the best that she can use to capture that, because frankly, none of they're all meaningless at the end of the day. These are things we don't really understand. And so I'm going to ask her after this, by the way, whether it was a personal or impersonal God that she encountered in her psilocybin state.
Ron, can you make sure that Brian's on your faculty? I mean, if you're going to have a course at Harvard, you got to have Brian on your faculty.
Yeah, no, well, I am already scheming and sent an email to one of my co-collaborators on this topic.
So, Brian, I'm going to ask one final question from a participant. Emily Langford is in Rochester, and she's aspiring to be in the palliative care field and wants to know about last rites and how that's sort of in the Greek practice, whether this was part of the palliative care. Emily, why don't you ask it directly?
I am curious if you know whether there were substances in wine used in last rites. Like we know about communion and that sacrament, but there are more than one sacrament, and we're interested in using psychedelics in the setting of hospice now. We've seen tremendous efficacy. I wondered if you knew anything about that.
I mean, if you're talking about the ancient Eucharist, you have to be talking about extreme unction. Any Catholic knows that's the last rites, the final chrismation, the holy anointing oil. I haven't found much evidence for that. Although that said, in the Gnostics, I focus on the Eucharist, but there are other scholars who focus on rites of baptism and initiation, which involved a chrismation and not just water in some sects, which would also include different rites of passage at the end of life. So not a lot on that, but I'll say that in the modern context, I think this is exactly the place where you could see the marriage of organized religion and psychedelics, if any. It's in the death and dying process. I don't think that psychedelics are here to replace the Sunday Eucharist, in any way compete with that. This is all very mystical, extra liturgical, extra clerical stuff. But if you think about what priests and pastors do, it's sit with the dead and dying a lot. And I wonder, in hospice or palliative care, I wonder what a tool in the hands of a priest or pastor would look like for someone in their final days, given all the work that Roland has done and Tony Bossis and others with end-of-life patients. That to me seems like the most obvious point of intersection between organized religion and psychedelics.
Hospice is a six month prognosis, so it seems like it would dovetail beautifully to me.
I couldn't agree more.
Thank you.
And Brian, I'd like to shout out Tony Bossis, who presented earlier to the BPRG, but you referenced him beautifully in your conversation with Andrew Sullivan. And I just wanted to shout out Tony, because he's certainly a very critical player in this field.
And a very proud Greek American, by the way, too. So he was the perfect person to interview.
Don't you think? I just want to make one point. I'm an incurable optimist, as I think you are as well. But you point out that the characteristics of these particular medicines evoke love, kindness, empathy, the kind of characteristics that may, in fact, as you suggest, help to save the planet. And so I want to get a little bit grandiose for a moment and say, based on the reading of your work, there's a huge potential for leaders of this country and of the world to engage in this beautiful expansion of consciousness, to see the world not as one to be exploited for human gain and greed, but one to be nurtured for the preservation of the species, frankly. And perhaps you want to say a few closing words before we close this particular segment.
No small question, Shippen.
This is your chance to make a huge, great statement, or just a humble thank you.
Well, I mean, I try and be clear that there's no original thought here. I mean, Aldous Huxley in 1958 talked about a revival of religion, and that it wouldn't happen through photogenic clergymen or televangelistic mass meetings. He talked about the discovery of biochemistry, these biochemical discoveries that would introduce the average person, whatever that means, to everyday mysticism, and that this everyday mysticism would give rise and inform everyday tasks and duties and everyday relationships. And he looked to psychedelics as the thing that could help foster this great revival and heal this divide between religion and science. I don't know what to make of that, but he was writing about this in the late 1950s, so it's not a new idea. But when you look at the clinical literature, and people seem to walk away from these experiences, even single doses, becoming more compassionate, more loving, more understanding, better versions of themselves, it begs a gigantic question. And it was a question that was asked 1600 years ago as Eleusis was about to be destroyed. I talk about this figure Praetextatus, who was an initiated Eleusis, and he makes this prophecy that the historian Sosimus records. And he says that to kill the mysteries is to kill us. That for some reason, whatever happened in Demeter's temple, whatever this visionary experience was, it was critical to the survival of the human species. Now, what the hell do we do with that? I don't know. And Carl Karenyi and no scholar since has been able to decipher what the heck that means. But there's something very sacred about these initiation rites that we've lost. We've clearly lost them. And maybe, as Aldous Huxley was writing about, Alan Watts, Houston Smith, one of the greatest religious scholars of the 20th century, when he took psilocybin as part of the Harvard Psilocybin Project, he walks away calling it the greatest cosmic homecoming he'd ever experienced. Right. Why is that? And why does this stuff impact people so profoundly? I don't know. But I think that we're in for a transformative decade. And I think that these 10 years that will follow this global pandemic, I think they'll prove to be transformative, because we have at our fingertips an incredibly powerful technology in psychedelics. And it will impact the future of medicine and the future of religion. And if you look back to the roots of Western civilization, it could impact our very democracy and the way we talk to each other and the way we interact with each other. There could be a missing ingredient to this toxic democracy. And I'm not saying psychedelics are the answer, but something like compassionate contemplative mysticism just might be. This is what Alan Watts talked about, a popular outbreak of mysticism where we treat each other like actual brothers and sisters. I don't know how to facilitate that, but I think it's one of the answers to societal ills.
Well, Brian, you have certainly advanced the conversation. You've created a community of people. You've excited a lot of minds and hearts and spirits. And we are incredibly grateful for your taking the time to be with us this afternoon. And we hope that you will stay engaged, and we'll see a lot of you, and often. And you know where we live in Cambridge, so don't be a stranger.
I'll see you soon.
So much on behalf of all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shipping it in. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right.
So you don't have to leave, but
okay,
we can take the spotlight off of you. Many, many thanks to both Brian and Shippen and everyone who asked those wonderful questions. So there are many more that come out of those, so it's going to be fun to continue the discussion.
Yeah.
We now, as we traditionally do, finish up our meeting with what I always call the dessert, and that is an update from Rick Doblin about what he's been up to. Hey, Rick, nice to see you.
Yes, and Jim and Brian, yes, thanks for that. And let me just say, I'm so glad that Brian didn't end with a humble thank you, but he ended with a very expansive how these things could help contribute to making a better world.
God bless you, Rick. You were the instigator, as you know.
I was so glad to be that, and yeah, and I think these times call for these broad visions and practical steps as well. So just to give a brief update of where we're at, the first thing I wanted to say is that as many of you may know, in the cover of the Sunday Review today of the New York Times was this op-ed by Michael Pollan, and it's about the drug war. And what are we going to do about drugs? The drug war is dying. And so actually, Michael is on a book tour for his new book, a virtual book tour. And so he and I are going to have a discussion about that tomorrow. And so I just want to point out a few areas of a disagreement in a sense, or just different perspectives. So that for those of you that haven't read it, I think it is worth reading what he had to say. And so what I'm going to do is just start with some, and I've sent all these things to Michael ahead of time, by the way. So I'm just going to start with a few quotes from his article, and then my responses to that. And so this is also something that just happened a few days ago, is that Christian Angermeyer and I, Christian being the founder of Atai, which is the most highly valued now psychedelic pharma company with a $2.8 billion market cap that just went public a couple weeks ago. We had a discussion about the for-profit versus nonprofit, and trying to highlight our areas of agreement and also some areas of disagreement. And one of the main areas of disagreement that I had with Christian, and some concerns that people have expressed about some of the things that he said and some of the things that Compass has said, has been this whole question about drug development on the one hand, drug policy reform on the other. And what Christian said was that he's in favor of decrim, but he's against legalization. And he thinks that legalization maybe later, maybe a decade or so from now, would be a good idea, maybe, but that decrim makes sense. And the reason he's against legalization is that he feels that there'll be a lot of bad outcomes, and then these bad outcomes will generate a lot of media attention, and then that will cause a backlash, and then we'll have the suppression of medical research as well. So that's kind of like a recapitulation of what I think is in part a false narrative of what happened in the 60s. And it's not that different from some of the things that Michael was saying in his discussion today. So just by that as background, one of the things that Michael said was microdoses perhaps, but a macrodose of psilocybin is a powerful, consequential, and risky experience that demands careful preparation and an experienced sitter or guide. We will need to look elsewhere for models of safe and sane psychedelic use. So my concern there is this idea that it's a powerful, risky, consequential, and risky experience that demands careful preparation and an experienced sitter or guide. So that runs counter to this idea of people just having their own experiences. And so I think that his view that this is demanded is too conservative of a way to present it. And I think it, for me at least, it comes from this fundamental understanding of the drug war and prohibition being a fundamental violation of human rights. And we could go back to what Brian was saying about, direct spirituality versus mediated through priests and others, and that we should have this legal opportunity to do this without having to go through either religion or through medicine. And so when I think of it that way, even though I agree with Michael that you should have careful preparation, and it's helpful to have an experienced sitter or guide, but we all know about people that have had experiences on their own without sitters or guides that have worked out well, and very importantly. So I think this concept that we have to be extremely cautious about how we move towards changing the drug laws can be an endorsement of the status quo, even though there is some nod to change in the sense of decrim. Now, then Michael said, it's no wonder the bad trip became such a powerful meme and the culture turned against psychedelics. So I think this is one of my core critiques, is that the narrative of what happened in the 60s is that, there was all these difficult experiences, the bad trip became a powerful meme, and therefore people were frightened, and that's what really turned the culture against psychedelics. And so the basic summary you could say is that psychedelics gone wrong is what happened, and then therefore we can't do psychedelics legalization until we have all sorts of knowledge built into the society about making it go right. And so I think where that's an incorrect understanding is that it was really psychedelics going right for the same reasons that Brian just talked about, the value potentially of people having these connective unitive experiences and seeing everybody really as their self, as their brother, as their sister, as part of the same human family, the same family of life on earth, that it was those kind of experiences that motivated people to challenge the status quo about Vietnam, about racism, about environmental destruction, the environmental movement, women's rights movement. I think it was really psychedelics going right that caused the backlash, not psychedelics going wrong. So I think that's a really important background thing to keep in mind. Michael then went on to say there are numerous examples of indigenous peoples that have successfully incorporated psychedelic compounds into their cultures as a sacrament, medicine, or medium of communication. So I think that's really a good point. But where I would like to extend that, this idea of those cultures that have successfully incorporated psychedelic compounds, is that they have no age limits. I think one of the big drivers now of the drug war is that we have to protect children from drugs. Their brains are still developing. We'll get this out of people at McLean Hospital, claiming that brains are still developing and therefore, psychedelics are a bad thing, marijuana is a bad thing, alcohol is a bad thing. And those things are bad in excess, but I don't think that they're bad as ways to introduce people, particularly adolescents, for these rites of passage into adulthood, into adolescence. And so I think the question that I have here for Michael and others is, what does he really think about age limits? If indigenous people have really successfully incorporated psychedelics and they don't have age limits, I've mentioned this before, I was at a Navajo Native American church peyote experience on the Navajo reservation. And one of the Navajo Indians brought his 9-year-old son, and he spent the whole night. He didn't drink, he ate half a dose of peyote or whatever, less than the rest of us, but he was there with us. So I think this whole question about age limits is really important to think about. And so my proposal is actually that it be legal for adults in a licensed legalization, which I'll talk about in a minute, but illegal for kids unless their parents give it to them or give their permission for them to participate in ceremonies where other people give them, or contexts, or even you could maybe take it even further to think about high school proms where everybody is told not to have alcohol. And if you could have certain parents that say, yeah, my kids can drink alcohol, and you could do that in a supervised context, that would make a lot more sense than what we're doing now. So I think rites of passage, adults creating these contexts for kids, particularly their own kids, is really an important thing. Michael then goes on to say, we non-natives will need to design our own culturally appropriate containers for the secular, non-medical psychedelic experience. So that's totally right. I totally agree to that. But one of the secular containers, although it's been dramatically harassed by police and other authorities, have been all-night concerts that go till sunrise. A lot of Grateful Dead concerts in the olden days went till sunrise, also places like Burning Man. These are secular and non-medical, but also spiritual and communal. And so they have been denigrated as recreational, somehow or other frivolous and irresponsible. But I think that we have done a good job of culturally appropriate containers in some contexts, and we really need to facilitate that. And the idea of them going till sunrise is obviously to take a longer time so that people aren't on the road at 2 a.m. when they're still high. I think that the way the Native American church will go till sunrise, it's really important. And then Michael says, but what about the so-called hard drugs like heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine, drugs that people ostensibly take for pleasure? Is there a safe way to fold these more addictive molecules into our lives? And the statement that I've come to a lot is that the more dangerous the drug, the more important that it be legal. And, Carl Hart, who's an African-American neuroscientist at Columbia, who's written a book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, and has talked about his own use of different substances, decided he wanted to borrow that phrase. The more dangerous the drug, the more important that it be legal. And I think that that is, what do we do about hard drugs is used as an argument to block legalization, but I actually think the more dangerous they are, the more important that it be legal, so that we can have harm reduction methods. We can have pure drugs. So many people dying from opiates are dying from fentanyl that's in there that they don't know how much it is. They don't know the purity. We've got big problems with people doing drugs that they don't know what they're actually doing. We need harm reduction throughout the culture. We need treatment on demand. We need honest drug education. And I think that we see examples already in other countries of heroin maintenance programs. People who are addicted to heroin can indeed function if they don't have to live a life of crime and don't have to deal with the underground. But if they can get heroin maintenance and be in heroin maintenance programs, they can still lead productive lives. And now they're in touch with people that if they want help to get off, they can more easily access that. So that is the question, what does Michael say about that? And then the final step is this proposal originally by Tim Leary about what he called licensed legalization. And he made the point about you need a driver's license, and for psychedelics, maybe it's more like an airplane license, but that you have this license to do drugs. And the purpose of it, I think the way Leary talked about it was more about the education that you need to get the license. But the other part of it is that if you misbehave, you can have the license taken away from you. And you can go do more education. You get punished for whatever you your misbehavior, but not for your state of consciousness. And then you have to go to education classes or whatever, and then you get your license back. But this idea of licensed legalization, to me, is the way forward. And what we're talking about is going to be thousands and thousands of psychedelic clinics over the next decade. And I think that the idea of these psychedelic clinics is that people should be able to go to these clinics for their first experience. Kids, if they have their parents' permission, adults, and that then they will be able to have it for free because it'll be subsidized by all the taxes from people buying these recreationally or non-medically. And then once you've had an experience under supervision, then you get your license. So I think that that's how I envision it all. So anyway, that's my discussion now about Michael Pollan and legalization and non-legalization. So to give you a brief update on MAPS, what's happening, first off, I'll talk about how Bob Parsons, the founder of GoDaddy, a 70-year-old Vietnam vet billionaire, has just given $5 million over 4 years to Rachel Yehuda at the Bronx VA. So that's going to be terrific. That money is both for research and for training therapists, and also for eventually doing a group therapy study. And she's already got other funds to do an individual therapy study to train her team, and then to do 2 sessions versus 3 sessions. So it's been 31 years, and we're now about that. I've been trying since 1990 to start research inside the VA. So we're not at a point yet where the VA is willing to pay for things. It all has to be done by philanthropy from the outside, but it is starting to happen that the VA is going to be doing this. Also, the Loma Linda VA is about to start. So it's a little bit of a race who treats the first person inside the VA system, either Rachel or Shannon Remick and her team at the Loma Linda VA. And the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation has funded this group therapy study that'll take place at the Portland VA. And we're in the process of developing that protocol, submitting it to the FDA. And we're about to start expanded access. We had made a compromise with the FDA when we got the study approved, which was to agree at the time that there had to be a doctor on site and there had to be MD PhD as the lead therapist. And as I mentioned last time, we filed this formal dispute resolution with FDA, and we were able to overturn that. So now we're going to be amending the expanded access protocol. So the lead therapist can just be licensed to do therapy. We don't need a doctor on site, a doctor on call. This can reduce the cost of it. And again, this is compassionate use. People can pay for their own treatments, and it's for completing the training of therapists by supervising them as they work with their first PTSD patient, and then also getting more safety data. So the expanded access site that's going to start first up is the Aquilino, the one that Bob Kaufman is at, that's in Rockville, Maryland. And we hope that we'll get active duty soldiers as well as vets that will come to that site. And then we have other sites around the country that we're going to be starting. We also are doing a lot, this idea of bipartisan support. So Dan Crenshaw is the representative to Congress from Texas. He's very much a Republican and Trump supporter, not as extreme as others, but he's a former Navy SEAL. And so he's having a health summit that's going to be in Houston on the 23rd of July. Around 300 people come, and he's invited me and a few other people from different healthcare groups to be interviewed with him. Each one will be like a 15 or 20-minute interview. I'm the one that closes out the day. So I'm going to be going to Houston to be meeting with Representative Crenshaw. I've already had some really good talks with. He's very much a supporter of psychedelic research. And so Dan and Representative Tim Ryan from Ohio are working together on bills. One would give $25 million to the DoD, one would give $25 million to the VA for psychedelic research. And the DoD has indicated that they're not enthusiastic about that. We've also heard the VA say that they don't want to be told what to do. But I think we're going to most likely go forward anyway. But there's a few more discussions to figure out, why don't they want 25 million each of them? And what we're saying is it's either for MDMA, psilocybin, ibogaine, or 5-MeO DMT research. So those bills are coming, but we've got more negotiations to do. The other thing is on the 16th, which is coming right up, we're about to submit a roughly a $12 million grant application to the state of Michigan. And this is for a cannabis study. And this will be cannabis in veterans for PTSD. And it's going to be THC versus placebo, somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 subjects. The money can only go to nonprofits or academic researchers. It's paid for by the legalization taxes. They have to give away $20 million a year for 2 years. We're the only one that we're aware of that has already developed a protocol and already submitted it to FDA. And the only one that we're aware of that's even planning to do an FDA-approved studies. There's other people claiming that the law doesn't mean what it says and that they can get funding even though they're going to do observational studies with state legal marijuana, which is not what the law says. But in any case, I think we may build on the 2.2 million that we got from the state of Colorado for our marijuana PTSD study in 76 vets, and this will be in somewhat like 300 vets. And we're not going to use the crappy government marijuana. We're going to import it either from Australia, Canada, or Israel. So it'll be high quality THC versus placebo. Now, we're also moving forward in Europe with our studies there to train therapists. And that's moving slowly because of COVID still in Europe, but we have treated people in the Czech Republic, treated people in the Netherlands, and we're moving forward in other countries. And so we're really moving in this globalization. We're also going to start looking at what do we need to do in Brazil. We've had one phase 2 study in Brazil, and we're trying to figure out what routes to approval there are in Brazil, in Israel and Canada, also in England because of the Brexit, the British version of the FDA, MHRA. They want to show benefits from Brexit. So they want to approve drugs faster than the European Medicines Agency. So we're going to be exploring that with the MHRA. And we've got this group, again, supporting wounded veterans that Bob knows, that they're super well connected to the power structure in England. They've had the head of the British military endorse MDMA research, but they're helping us with these discussions with MHRA. And then the last big thing that I'd like to share is that, we did have our board of directors meeting. We did come out with a $150 million fundraising plan, $50 million a year for 3 years. And there are, in the history of MAPS, we've only raised, not only, but we've raised about 115 million so far, which is a lot of money. But what we want to do now is go forward with raising 150 million more. And the reason that we want to do that is threefold. The first thing is that we want to globalize so that, as I mentioned, in Europe, we're going to need around 30 million to make MDMA medicine throughout the European Medicines Agency, throughout Europe. And then if we have FDA and EMA approval, that'll get us approval in most countries of the world for MDMA for PTSD without other research required in those countries. We will have to do open label studies to complete the training of the therapists there. But that we won't have to do a lot more research in those countries. So that's 30 million. Then, as I mentioned, we've hired Boston Consulting Group, and we're going to figure out the path to commercialization. We're going to need around 70 million or so, according to them, if we were big pharma, to spend between now and before 2024. We think the end of 2023 is when we get the drug approved. But that's to properly prepare for commercialization, and that means hiring about 65 more people. Not all right away, but in sequence over the next couple of years, and also having lots of outside contractors. And a lot of this work is building your sales force and building your outreach to insurance companies. That's going to be really key to our plans. We do have a plan to have 1 million MDMA sessions in the first 6 years after approval. And that would be 500,000 patients, each with an average of 2 sessions. So that's our goal. We'll need to train over 24,000 therapists in order to accomplish that. And so we're trying to do that. And then there's another part, which is that this point of sustainability that we're projecting, that in the middle of 2024, we think we'll earn enough money in the Public Benefit Corp from the sale of MDMA by prescription to cover our operational costs to continue to do more research. So, we have 120 people now. We're going to be expanding dramatically. And so that's another 30, 40 million, and then 10 million or so contingency. So that's 150 million, 50 million a year for 3 years. And the 4 different ways that we're trying to raise the money, I'll start with the least likely, but in some ways, the least likely, but in some ways the easiest is an IPO. We've just seen, because we're the only psychedelic company in phase 3, and we have a successful phase 3 study, and it was so successful, it looks like phase 3 the second study will work as well. And according to BCG, depending on where we price the drug and depending on insurance coverage, there's 750 million or more in profits. Could be substantially more than that, but it's hard to say exactly. So we think that we'd be valued well over $1 billion. So that basically with 115 million so far and 35 years of effort, we've built over $1 billion of public value. But the challenge with IPO, we could easily raise a couple $100 million selling maybe 20% of the benefit corp, something like that. However, there's a problem in the law in the sense that the public benefit corp, what you do is you maximize public benefit over profit. And minority shareholders are not supposed to be able to sue the management if you're not maximizing profit. But the question is, where do you draw that line between public benefit and profit? And there's no clear place for that. And there's no established law about lawsuits against management of benefit corps. So there's a risky aspect of bringing in capital through a benefit corp, even if it's nonprofit majority ownership of a public benefit corp, and you get even carefully selected investors. How much will that change what you do? And how much will that shift from maximizing public benefit to maximizing profit? So that's unclear. The next step up for us in terms of desirability, we could say, is partnerships with for-profit companies that want to partner with us and give us cash for all of the value of our MDMA research that we have on either bringing MDMA to Europe or new indications of MDMA. And so we are exploring multiple different partnerships with for-profit companies. The difference there between an IPO and doing this is that, first off, we'd have to give away more of the profits than if we do an IPO ourselves. But we're negotiating contracts that we just have to comply with. We're not exposed to as much uncertainty. It's these partners that have taken the money and will have made these partnerships with us that have to deal with the investors. We just have to deal with these companies according to contracts that we've already negotiated. So I think that we are actively exploring that, and there may be even partnerships with companies that are bring expertise more than money in terms of commercialization or things like that. Then we're exploring loans, sort of philanthropic loans would be low interest loans that are forgivable if we fail, which we don't think will happen, but we could. So we can't afford to pay it back. So it's more like philanthropic, people have to be willing to lose the money, basically. But we think it's 90% or so likely that we're going to succeed. But you can't guarantee that, and we've got no collateral. So we're looking for that. And then, of course, the other one is philanthropy. And that's our first choice, but it's really complicated these days because so many people are seeing all the profits that are being made in this area and are interested in donating, are interested in investing rather than donating. So we're having, you could say, the headwinds of our success from creating this for-profit industry has made it more difficult for us to raise philanthropic dollars. So our main work over the next couple months is going to be this fundraising, and we're exploring all 4 of these options to try to make sure that by the end of the year we've launched at least one of them and raised at least 50 million. And then the other part is that we're now waiting to hear any day now from the FDA about what's called the REMS, the Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies. So this will have a big impact also on how psychedelic psychotherapy goes forward and how it's regulated. And so we have already submitted a document. We're waiting back to hear from FDA. We're already working over the weekend. I've been working on our reply to the FDA. But the main things here are that we're trying to make it so that it's administered only under direct supervision. And of course, we think that that's what the FDA is going to require. And that's what we think is it's never a take-home medicine. And that there's a training program that's required by the sponsor for training the therapists and training the prescribers. So we're just starting to have developing a 2 to 4 hour training for prescribers who don't want to be therapists, doctors, just about the safety risks. And then we want the training to be required for the people that are in direct touch with the therapists. And the training will either be by MAPS through our training program. We now have 310 people in our training program. In September, we're starting another one with, we anticipate 500 people. That this idea of training being required going forward, because it's not the drug, it's the therapy that's the active thing. The drug makes the therapy more effective. And that will also ensure quality. So the same concerns that Michael or Christian had about legalization causing problems and having bad outcomes and backlash, I'm very concerned about medicalization of untrained therapists getting in over their heads and not being able to properly support people and having that be problematic, and then having a backlash from that. And then that could go after medical use. So we think that FDA is likely to do this. The thing that we're trying to finesse a little bit is you probably know that we have a 2-person therapy team, and we do think that that is the best. And I don't think that the FDA is going to permit anything less until we do more studies. Now, when we're going to try to do a group therapy study, that will be actually what we're proposing is 4 therapists for 6 veterans with PTSD. Now it's 2 therapists for 1 person, and we have done cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, conjoint meaning couples or dyads, where 1 person has PTSD, it affects the relationship. And we blended MDMA with that with Candace Monson, who developed it. And that was 2 therapists and 2 people getting MDMA at the same time, 1 a PTSD patient and the other person impacted by that. So we've had that sort of 1-to-1. We want to go to 4 therapists to 6 people in the group therapy. But what will happen post-approval? Will there be a requirement that there be 2 therapists for every person that's getting it? So far, we're just trying to finesse that and say that's outside of the REMS, although we do want that. The other thing that we need to challenge eventually is that the second person, according to FDA, needs a bachelor's degree, needs to be in a programmed to get a license or needs 1,000 hours of behavioral health experience. And we think that none of those should be necessary, that the second person could be an untrained college student that's studying psychology, that's working under the direction of the first person. But we do think the two-person model is better, safer than the one-person model. So we will see how this comes. The thing that is likely, but we don't want it, is this idea of a patient registry. And then the FDA could end up saying that there's a lifetime limit on the number of MDMA sessions that somebody could get. And we'd be okay with that anyway, because if you have 8 or 10 MDMA sessions and you still have PTSD, it's not working. So, and other things should be tried, or you need more time integrating between the experiences, something like that. So I think the next 6 months or so will be really like what Brian, I think you were saying about the next 10 years after, is going to be very pivotal for our culture. I would say that the next 6 months is going to be very pivotal for MAPS in terms of both our fundraising, of how we go forward and what kind of pressures that we have, or what kind of compromises we have to make, what kind of incentives we have to watch out for. And also these negotiations with FDA to get a real sense of how this might be done post-approval. And as the final thing, I'll say that we are now tracking on a weekly basis when we get the interim analysis for our second phase 3 study. We're doing whatever we can to try to increase enrollment faster in our second phase 3 study. It's very, very difficult to do that, but it now looks like it's the end of April 2022 that we'll have the interim analysis of the second phase 3 study. And if that looks good, then it's almost certain that we'll get approval. That study should be done in October of 2022. And we anticipate by around the middle of 2023 is when we'll have approval for MDMA for PTSD in the US, and then also a year later, more or less in Europe. So that's our big picture. And it's terrific to be with you today and to just give you all this update. And if there's time for discussion or questions, I'd be glad to engage in them.
Great. Many, many thanks. As always, inspirational, Rick. Thank you. Thank you. I have one just logistic question right from the beginning with your discussion with Michael tomorrow. Yeah. Is that a public discussion that we could listen to?
It is, but it's a fee, I think. So let me see if I can, if you go to Eventbrite, it's part of his virtual book tour.
Oh, okay.
And I can see if I can put it in the chat. Let me see if I can find it. But it should, I think it's $31 and you get a
book
copy of his book as well, a signed copy of his book.
Thank Brian for doing that.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian, for being free.
Yeah.
And Rick for being free. Everyone who presented today was for free. Thank you.
Oh, let me just say something that happened yesterday, which was, Clubhouse, which is this new app that, you can have discussions, virtual discussions, where it's no video, it's only audio and you can bring people up. There's a lot of people that are using Clubhouse for psychedelic type discussions. So Facebook realizes that Clubhouse is growing in popularity. So they're trying to create their own thing, Facebook Live. And so I did one with Jason Silva, and they paid for 1 hour, they paid MAPS $15,000 for 1 hour on the Facebook Live, because they're trying to compete with Clubhouse.
Wow.
I thought that this would be a good way for them to start doing that. So while I'm free today, I was
you were really
$1,000 for 1 hour for MAPS the other
Getting
day.
the deal.
Oh, wow. Well, you're worth every penny, Rick, of ours and theirs, right?
Wow.
Ron Miss has a comment he'd like to make.
Yeah,
Ron?
hi, Rick. Great to see you as always.
Hey, Ron.
Yeah, and when you mentioned the ratio of therapists to patients, and your preference that the best way is with two therapists, even if one is more junior. You know, I think you're aware, of course you are, of the study that we're doing, you know, Sunstone's leading at the Aquilino Cancer Center.
Yeah, yes.
And our model is 4 patients are treated simultaneously, each with one therapist. And then there's a lead therapist monitoring everything in another room through a whole AV system. And I will say we have one more protocol to dose. There's 30 people going through the study, and the last cohort will be treated this month. So we have already, you know, 26 of them, and the data is extremely powerful. So that'll be written up and published before the end of the year. But just toss it out there as, you know, one example of a model that doesn't have 2 therapists with each patient. And the outcomes are, you know, amazing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing. You know, so I think what you have is you have one therapist in each room with 4 people dosed simultaneously, and then you have 2 people monitoring things on videotape. Or not, but like active monitoring.
Live video, they're right there. And it's in the next room. If they need to go in, they can.
Okay, so it's really more or less 1.5 persons.
1.25. 1.25.
One and a, well, no, if it's 6 for 4.
Yeah, 6 for 4 right now.
I'm sorry.
In this study, it's 6 for 4.
Okay.
But anyway, so I just want to point out again, I mean, it's a question, I guess. How vital is it that there be 2 therapists sitting with the patient as opposed to various other models? And I'm just, you know, I share with you the example of the one we're doing in this study.
Yeah, well, I think if we look at underground psychedelic therapy, you know, or, you know, it's one therapist for one person, almost exclusively. It's very rarely 2. And sometimes it is 2, but I think we know that the one therapist for one patient model can work. And I think it can work well, and it can work even with LSD that's a longer session than psilocybin, or even with ibogaine.
Right.
I mean, there was one point with Leo Zeff, we talk about him as the secret chief who really introduced MDMA into therapy. And ibogaine lasts a very long time. It was like a 12-hour, for me, active session. I mean, it took me days to recover, but Leo was a sitter for me. I remember about hour 10 where I'm vomiting and throwing up after like 8 hours of vomiting and throwing up. And I opened my eyes and I saw Leo was reading a book. I was like, oh my gosh. And then I thought, I wish he could help me. But then I realized there's nothing he could say. I've got to do it myself. So I think even in very long sessions, a single therapist model can work. But we're going to have to demonstrate that to FDA before we would have regulations that I think will permit that. Or, as you're saying, Ron, in the group therapy context. But I will say in our group therapy that we believe that each person should have, each of the vets with PTSD should have an individual session first before there's a group administration. And we're going to do it differently than the way you described, in that you had 4 people in 4 different rooms with one person in each one. We're going to have 6 people in one room, all, you know, doing it at the same time. And there'll be a bunch of the initial hours that'll mostly be internal, but then there'll be a lot more dialogue. And that's, I think, a difference between MDMA and psilocybin, where that there will be a lot more interaction between the people. But we do think that for people that are seriously traumatized, that having their first session in a group might not work as well as having their first session individually. Mm-hmm. And so that's how we're going to step by step cautiously move to group therapy.
Yeah, thanks.
And Rick, if you still can stay with us, Ron Siegel has a question.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Ron?
I'll double my fee. Yeah.
Okay.
Like double 2 times 0.
How about dinner tomorrow?
Hi, Rick. Could you say more about your counter argument to the idea that, you know, the publicity about the bad trips was what made things go wrong in the 60s and 70s? Because that is such a prevalent narrative. You know, you mentioned it, but could you elaborate?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that did happen, and that did turn public opinion in a way that was negative and built a lot of fear. But I'd say the best counterexample was John Ehrlichman, and we may have people may be aware of this quote, but this was he was interviewed at the end of the 70s by a fellow named Dan Baum, and what he said, and it wasn't released then, or didn't get much notice till much later. But what Ehrlichman said was that for the Nixon White House, their two main enemies were civil rights activists and the hippies, and they couldn't actually stop them from protesting because of that pesky thing called the Constitution, but that they could criminalize the drugs that they did and use those criminal laws to break up their meetings, to arrest their leaders, to disrupt their organizations. And then Ehrlichman says, did we know that we were exaggerating the risks of these drugs? Of course we did. So that for me, why is Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America, according to Nixon? You know, why did he really escalate the drug war? And I don't think the drug war has ever really been about reducing drug abuse. You know, if it was, you would have a lot more harm reduction, you would have a lot more honest drug education. So I think it's easy to make that statement that it was psychedelics gone wrong and bad trips that caused the backlash. But I really think it was the identification of the hippies with LSD, with anti-Vietnam War protests, with John Lennon, you know, the bed in for peace, all of that. So that's and I'm curious, Run, do you think, you know, how do you look back on it?
Well, it's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about as deeply as you have, because I was buying into that more prevalent narrative that, you know, people got freaked out, but of course it was terribly political at the same time. And it has me wondering now, because, you know, I noticed that, for example, all of your work and everyone else's, you know, seemed to be completely not picked up in the culture wars. You know, it just didn't seem to get picked up by all of the Trump supporters and others, you know, looking for issues that could make America back to a way it used to be. But I've had the thought of, might they see this as, you know, critical race theory doesn't pan out or loses steam, you know, might this be the next boogeyman?
Well, I think not. And I think the reason is because of a strategic decision to work with veterans and to highlight their experiences, both in the media and in our work. You know, the thing that I've actually gotten the most criticism for has been taking $1 million from Rebecca Mercer, who was, you know, the funder of the owner of Cambridge Analytica, a big supporter of Trump and Bannon. But I think that the religious right, the sort of Republican Party is so wrapped around the flag and wrapped around support of veterans that they're going to have a hard time going up against all these veteran voices that psychedelics are helpful to them. And we have a crisis of veteran suicides. You know, the sad part is that most of the people that are traumatized in this country are women. It's from sexual violence of some sort or domestic violence, but they don't get as much attention, and there's not as much organized support for them as there is for veterans. So like I just said, Bob Parsons just gave $5 million over 4 years to Rachel Yehuda to support veterans. So I think that the success of our strategy is demonstrated exactly by what you said, is that so far this has been a bipartisan issue. And that's why it's so important that we're working with Congressman Crenshaw and Tim Ryan. Tim Ryan is a very progressive Democrat. And for him and Crenshaw to be working on the same thing is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you so much for elaborating on that.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. We also had a really good update, Rick, earlier from Bob Kaufman about when he presented to Dan Crenshaw.
Maybe Bob wants to come on.
Yeah, Bob, are you still with us?
I see his picture still.
Well, anyways, he gave us a wonderful insider's view of what it was like to be talking to that.
I am.
Oh, good. Yeah, could you talk about just about what you think about the chances of a backlash also? And
Well, I haven't even had the opportunity to meet with any of my colleagues at Walter Reed in terms of what they thought. You know, there's a reason why Representative Ryan wanted the panel discussion focused on alternative forms of healing and not psychedelic medicine.
But certainly psychedelics are part of it.
Yeah. But that was the
We
title.
know that.
The reality was that's what you talked about, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, it was clear that the panel discussion was about psychedelics, but for the memo to go out through the, you know, throughout the congressional, you know, distro, it was called alternative healing.
Right, interesting, yeah. Thank you.
But Dick, but Rick, you're talking to Dan Crenshaw independently, and now you're going down to this Houston conference.
That's
Yeah.
good.
Oh yeah. I mean, he's heard from so many Navy SEALs about their work with ibogaine, with 5-MeO-DMT, with MDMA. You know, Rick Perry from Texas has heard so much from some of the subjects in our studies, and also from the vets. And we have, you know, Amber and Marcus Capone from Veterans Exploring Treatment Options Strategies. You know, they're the ones that have helped hundreds of Navy SEALs go down to Mexico for ibogaine and 5-MeO, and lots are going down for ayahuasca to South America. So yeah, I think that they're comfortable acknowledging psychedelics as having benefits. And also there's this libertarian strain in the Republican Party. You know, it's all about freedom and stuff. And that you would think that the logical part of that is antipathy towards the government telling you what drugs you can put into your body or your brain. So we're sort of playing on that as well.
That's great. Good. Dana has her hand raised, and then I think we probably should close it out after that. You've been very generous with your time, as always, Rick. Thank you. Dana?
Hey, Rick, it's Dana in Santa Fe. I just had a vet actually call from our website, and she said that the VA in Albuquerque has been watching our expanded access site and told her about the treatment. And she's thinking that they are willing to pay for her to go through the treatment if she's accepted as a candidate.
Wow.
And she was asking, like, who do we connect her with the VA? Like, who does the VA need to talk to about actually paying to get the sessions?
Wow.
Huh. I'd be shocked if that actually turns out that way, but I think that she should talk to the people at the Albuquerque VA, because it's more of a local decision, I would think, than
They were the ones who told her to contact us.
but
Underneath their like alternative treatments. And so now she's going back and figuring out if they'll, like, means that they had her contact me, does that mean that they're actually willing to pay for it? And like, what's the paperwork she has to go through to get that all set up? And I told her, like, you still have to be accepted as a participant first, but because of the slowness of the military, she wanted to try and get a head start on it.
yeah, okay, so I'm going to put in the chat. This is a woman from the VA that we have spoken to quite a bit about MDMA research, and she's connected with the central office where they do research. So I just put it in the chat. Everybody can see it. But if
Okay.
you can suggest that she write to that person,
Okay.
and see, she might say she has nothing to do with payment decisions. And Bob, I don't know if you've got any suggestions, but I'd be shocked if they pay for it. Like, just for example, the Phoenix VA, you know, this marijuana PTSD study, it's going to be, we're connected with the Tampa VA, with in Phoenix, with 2 sites in Michigan. If we get the grant we've talked about to the Phoenix VA, would they even let their people know about the study? And they've refused to do that and said that it's, you know, they won't refer to outside studies. You know, one of John Lubecki, who's a vet does a lot of work for us and is, reached out actually to Crenshaw and to Ryan and others. The reason he found out about us is that he was at his VA in Charleston, and the person that he normally sees wasn't there, and he saw somebody else, and they passed him a piece of paper over the desk and said, "Don't look at this till you leave the building." And when he opened the note, when he left the building, it said, "Google MDMA for PTSD." And that's where he found out about our study, and then he volunteered for our study. And he'd previously attempted suicide multiple times. So they were not even comfortable sharing with him that this thing existed in any direct way like that. Wow. So I'd be shocked if the VA would pay for it. But Ilse Weikers is her name, and she would be the place that I would start to see.
Rick, I wouldn't, I'd wait until the bill came out to contact Ilse. I just think that, they're walking such a fine line, and Ilse's hands are tied.
Yeah, well, if you don't think it would be worth it, who else then could this person ask?
Have her route it through me.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
And what is your contact information? Could you put it in the chat?
I'll put it in the chat.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, that's terrific. And we could also find some scholarship money if the VA doesn't do it. If the VA is willing to refer somebody, just that is phenomenal. And so, if they're not willing to pay for it, we'll try to find the money somehow.
Okay, great.
That's great, because we'd really like to see your expanded access site up and running too.
Exactly.
It'd be awesome. Great. Well, let's wait for Bob to get his contact info. Anything else? Any other final statements? No, thank you.
Thanks to the affinity groups. Thanks to Brian. Thanks to Rick. My God.
Yeah.
Great meeting.
Really wonderful meeting, everyone. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your summers, and we'll see you in September with Amanda Fielding.
All right.
That's going to be fun. We hope that she even is going to be in Boston. So,
well, that'd be good. Let me just mention one thing, which is that her son Cosmo has started Beckley SciTech, and they're one of the groups that we're exploring partnering with.
Oh, great. That's great to hear. Good. Well, we'll know more hopefully in September.
Yeah. See you soon, Rick, we hope.
Yes.
Great work.
Thank you.
Great meeting. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks to all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Usually. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.